The film's been in release for a little over a year, or just about a year?
Actually, about 10 months.
10 months.
Yeah.
What's been the response so far?
Well, it did really well. I mean, we wish we would have been in the theaters. We were in 670 theaters for one night. We got a Monday night because we weren't a big, studio, but we had an encore presentation too. But we had about 85,000 people come and see the film in the beginning. And so tremendous response in that regard. I was in New York City in Times Square to almost a packed theater. I couldn't believe that people in Times Square would come to see it, all the way to Hawaii, we were in. And then the follow-up response was people said, I can't believe that a documentary is my favorite film. They were saying so many encouraging things that we started to get what we would call evangelists, people that said, this is really important, because what the film gave people now was a tool. You could show this to just about anybody. If whatever their persuasion, if they were an atheist or agnostic or just an uncle who likes history or whatever, but you've never been able to talk to him about, the Bible, this film has enough intrigue and it's balanced enough that anybody can watch it. We showed it at a theater in Uptown area, and we had people to fill out forms. And I'm going to throw one atheist in from another showing so I can get to 10, but we had 9 out of 10 gave the film a good to excellent rating. And so I realized we had made something that was very unique. To have a film that's about the Bible, the Exodus, and have 9 out of 10 atheists give it a good to excellent rating and would recommend it to their friends, we realized we had something, because Christians loved it. But now I've got both spectrums, people that don't believe in God and people that believe in God and worship Him, both agreeing on something. That was a breakthrough. And we won about, a number of awards, 12 or 15 awards in film festivals. We won the best Christian film, both feature. We beat out the feature films at one award, and we won in LA. We won awards. We won World Houston Best Director out of 4,500 films, which was a great achievement for myself. So, and then it was picked up. It was in Walmart, and it was on Amazon. It was the #1 documentary in August in Amazon, and it's gone on to. You can purchase it. It's in Christian bookstores, and you can buy it from our website at patternsofevidence.com, and it's on Netflix now. So there's a whole new crowd that's seeing the film. So it's having, I think, a great impact because it's in the culture.
That's a really important point you made there, because one of the great problems with Christianity today is when young people go to their universities, they lose their faith because of what they're told at these universities by the liberal scholars. And the liberal scholars are basing their evidence on the same evidence that scholars in archaeology have found no evidence for the Bible in the time of Ramesses II for Exodus, etc. So what this film does is it not only helps us to get those people back into the fold, but it means that because it's a strong visual representation of the story, that's what kids tune into. They're not so keen on the words. They want to see the impact on a big screen. And so the effect on youth is a very, very strong effect, which is what you've experienced, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is something that's really important, that those kids are not going to go to university and lose their faith. They're going to be reinforced by this film.
And so it's interesting that you're finding that the audience that's attracted to the film is not strictly those of faith already, but
not at all.
You're finding that it's appealing to the non-believing.
Yeah. Big time. Audience. Yeah, people are like, their heads are spinning, and I'm really pleased with that, because it's giving people something to think about. And I think this is the issue, is that there's actually an entry point into people's lives. And oftentimes, it's not just the heart. It can be the mind. In fact, that's probably some ways how people leave faith, is through their mind. Well, people can come to faith because of the way they think, or what they've been challenged to think about. And I think that if anyone is honest after they watch this film, they're going to go, you know what, something's going on here. And if you show someone 2 hours of an investigation where you're telling them the entire biblical narrative from Abraham, through to the conquest, there's going to be a residual effect. And I think that this film is good in that way, because it's a great opportunity for people to not, in a non-threatened way, because they have questions about this. Many people who are atheist or agnostic actually have family members who are people of faith that believe in the Bible. And there's an alienation between them. They can't talk about these things. This, I think, has been a great opportunity to basically watch this and go, okay, well, let's talk now. We've got something we can talk about.
So, David, has the process of making the film had any impact on you in your agnosticism?
Can I say that I'm getting there? Is that a valid thing to say?
Getting where?
It's a long, stony road that I travel, because as a historian, you have to take the reality of the biblical story in the archaeological evidence and the narrative as truthful, as real now. So I'm conflicted by the events of the conquest, the destruction of those Canaanite cities and the populations. I'm conflicted with Saul forgiving the Amalekite, but then being cursed because of his forgiveness. Whereas the New Testament, I can grip that and hold to that very strongly. I struggle with some of the narrative stories or the realities of the Old Testament narratives. That's where I have my problem at the moment. And as a historian, you have to face the realities of what that text is actually telling us. So I grapple with those issues, those moral issues, whereas I find total empathy with the Jesus narrative and the teachings of Jesus. So that's where I struggle. I struggle with the time, if you like, the time of the Exodus narrative, the time of the conquest, those years in the pre-Christian era, if you like. Mm-hmm. That's where I struggle. But you can't separate the two, because the New Testament is dependent on the Old. It's linked without any question.
So you would say that we've had these discussions that it's hard for him to understand how David could have someone murdered, commit adultery and all these different things and be forgiven, and yet Saul, who doesn't seem to have done as many bad things, is in the place that he is. That's where your conflict.
Yeah, it's those sorts of issues that I'm confronted by, and I have difficulty with. Saul's a bit of a hero to me. He gets a bad press, Saul, but it's the usual story, isn't it? The victor always writes the history, and David wrote the history of Saul, effectively. So I have sympathy for Saul. In the same way as Ramesses II, if we go back to the Exodus, was always depicted as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the oppressor of the Israelites. But now we know he wasn't. So things change. When your historical perspective is put down, you see the reality of it, then you can see a different way of looking at things. But I still struggle with those issues. I struggle with the conquest issues. And so that's where I'm at the moment.
And when you say conquest issues, just so we understand, is that you have a hard time with the idea that cities were destroyed and women and children and
infants, and the slaughter of the women, except the virgins who are then taken to be wives of the conquerors, which is what I see in modern history today with ISIS, ISIL. I see exactly the same thing going on. Where they take Christian women and they take them as wives, and I just find it hard.
So your struggle is not with the historicity of the
Not
events.
at all.
Your struggle is with the moral, ethical issues they depict
of that particular era, and I see a difference in the New Testament. I see a very different teaching. You love your enemy, you love your neighbour, you forgive people. There's none of that in the Old Testament that I can see.
Well, I think that's where the locus of the discussion has to happen, as the new covenant is new covenant, and grace is grace in ways that weren't affecting the Old Testament accounts. One of the questions that I have for you, David, is that this idea of the new chronology, which is the basic thesis of the film and of your particular position, has not been embraced widely by the academic community. And why is that?
Well, could I add one thing?
Sure.
Actually, the basic thesis of the film is we're looking for patterns.
Right.
And the question then, which we haven't explored, is why. And so I just want to make that clear, is that we're looking for patterns, and he's coming along and saying, I have a reason why. There could be other reasons. So that's...
Yeah, I think that's a very good position you took, because you're saying, let's just look where the sequence fits. Okay, how the sequence fits in that particular case is to do with chronology, which is a very complex subject area. There are very few specialists in chronology in the modern world. You may have about 50 academics who are actually involved in working on chronology, ancient chronology. It's a very complex subject area. It was my specialism at university. I studied the Third Intermediate period, which is one of those dark ages in Egyptian history, which nobody touches, nobody dares go near it. It's a quagmire of complications. So I was working on that, and the problem you have is the establishment of the timeline of ancient history is bequeathed to the whole ancient world by the Egyptian dating system, because Egypt is so rich in texts and documentation and inscriptions, and yet the world of Greece or Anatolia or any of those places, Minoan Crete, even biblical archaeology, has no text on its monuments. There are no carvings, inscriptions on the monuments. If you go to Megiddo, you don't see on the Solomonic gate, you don't see an inscription saying Solomon built this gateway. But in Egypt, you do. You have every single gateway is inscribed by the king who made it. So Egyptologists bequeath to the rest of the ancient world their dating systems. So if you change one little bit of Egyptian history, everything else has to change too. I'll give you an example. We have the Trojan War in the late Bronze Age in Anatolia between the Greeks and the Trojans, and then you have Homer writing about it 400 years later. There's a detachment between Homer and the story, and in between there's this thing called the Greek Dark Age. Well, if you take 300 years out of Egyptian history, that Dark Age disappears completely. And Homer is now writing about the Trojan War within 2 generations of the war itself, hence why he knows so much about it. So it has implications for all over the ancient world. And of course, all the different scholars in the different disciplines have to adjust their thinking, their whole reasoning for writing what they've written in the past, and all the books they've written have to be adjusted because of it. That's a huge implication for them, and it's why they're so resistant to it. Professor Max Planck, the famous physicist, once said you have to wait for one generation to die off before a new idea can be accepted by the next generation who come along who are now familiar with it. And in a sense, that's what's happening here. As you probably know, when people debate, it's very rare that one side of the debate will concede the other side. That very rarely happens. So sometimes you have to wait for the younger generation to come through, and they're not, so concerned about the issues of the older generation. That's the situation we're in now, I think.
I found that when people ask me, well, what do other scholars think about this? And it's a lot of them won't even talk about the pattern. They will just focus on one little area that they don't like, and that's their rebuttal. And so I think what David is bringing up is the idea that when you make a film like this, I just felt that it's really important that people know that there is a pattern of evidence for the Bible, because right now that is not what we're going to get if you go off to university. In fact, I've heard it multiple times. People said they went off to university and their professor just said, okay, I just want you to know, and sometimes these are Christian universities, there is no evidence that we have for these events. And that's the polite way of saying it. There's a lot of other things that basically that can be added to those kinds of dialogues. And we had one of one of the fellows who he and his wife helped to invest in our first film. He told me this last year. He said his son came back from the university and said, I'm an atheist. And he said, Tim, I feel so bad. He says, he just never got any answers. Everyone said, don't worry about it, just have faith. And if you're an intellectual or a thinking type person, that doesn't work very well, because you're in conflict, and eventually you say, you know what, I'm not going to follow this. There's no evidence there. There's no, and I do think that the mainstream, let's say, way of thinking, academia, basically wants to put people of faith into this touchy-feely thing over here, and that they're the intellectuals. But I don't think that history actually demonstrates that at all. And we won't get into all the characters that were incredibly intellectual that were people of faith. But you can't have one or the other. We've talked about this. You have to have faith and reason. And so we shouldn't be afraid, right, of the of the intellectual dialogue or of the evidence. Because I've gone on this 12-year search, and it's surprising how much the patterns are starting to show up if you know what to look for.